Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is located on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of the country for thousands of years. We also want to pay our respect to the First Nations elders of the countries we are all sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. I'm also very proud to acknowledge that the music you just heard along with the slideshow is from our research fellow, Dr. Nicholas Earn, an amazing composer and musician. The aim of my China Story Conversation series is to bring a deeper and a wider understanding of the multifaceted and humanized China through sharing lived experiences and knowledge of China by public figures of Australians from a wide range of professions. The previous speakers, including Linda Javen, Tracy Holmes, Richard McGregor, who shared their fascinating stories and personal experiences concerning different aspects of China, which are very eye-opening and enlightening, not only to people who are interested in China, but also to people like me who came from China. Their stories make us see things that we didn't see before. If you missed those episodes, you can still watch the videos on our website, and Lindsay will post the link in the chat box. For this fourth episode, we are very excited and privileged to have one of the earliest international lawyers working and teaching in China in the early 1980s, Kevin Hobgood-Brown AM, who was simply called Bu Lang on his Chinese driver's license. You can see how concise and compact Chinese as a language is. To share his stories and experiences of living and working in China. The slideshow at the beginning of the session just gives you a glimpse of what Kevin will tell us. To open this session, we are very honored to have the distinguished historian and scholar who have also made a tremendous contribution to culture and education exchanges between Australia and China, Emeritus Professor David Walker, AM. Professor Walker has written extensively on Australians' responses to rising Asia from the mid-19th centuries to the present. His books on this relationship include Anxious Nation, Australia and the Rise of Asia, 1850 to 1939, and Stranded Nation, White Australia in an Asian Region, and his memoir, Not Dark Yet, A Personal History, which was translated into Chinese by Professor Li Yao. He has recently written a dual memoir with Li Yao entitled Happy Together, Bridging the Australian-China Divide, published by Melbourne University Press. Professor Walker was the inaugural BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University from 2013 to 2016, and is a director and a board member of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, FASIC. Now, please welcome Emeritus Professor David Walker, AM, to give an opening speech.
Thank you very much, Jing. It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Kevin. He is certainly an intriguing case study. He was born in Africa to American missionary parents, and whatever we may think of the missionary endeavour, that suggests a commitment to causes beyond the self, beyond self-promotion or one's own immediate career. It's also fair to say, I think, that America has a much stronger philanthropic tradition than Australia has. So I would suggest that Kevin has two very powerful channels of influence running through his background. One, the commitment to callings and causes larger than one's own through the family history, but also the philanthropic commitments that are so much part of American society. Now, Kevin has also, as you've indicated, been very much involved in Australia-Asia, and particularly Australia-China relations. He's served with great distinction on the Australia-China Council on the board, and as chair. He's served on the Australia-China Business Council and also on the Asia Society. And these are all quite substantial commitments. They require time, effort, and a good deal of energy. As you've also indicated, Kevin has a legal background. He taught at Peking University in, I understand it to be the early 1990s, but Kevin will correct any of the errors that we've made. And that was when Peking University was a very different institution from the university that we know today, coming out of the Cultural Revolution, not far behind. The circumstances, the conditions were much harsher and much more severe than they are in the modern Peking University. Now, Kevin also had a legal background. He had formal training in the law. He's a member of bar associations in Australia and in America, and has formal qualifications and expertise in Western law and also in Chinese law. So don't mess with Kevin. Now, it's also, I think, the case that that Kevin has always shown a significant commitment to improving Australia's understanding of the Asia-Pacific region, of Australia's place in that region. And his work in that area has come on top of a very substantial business career in facilitating business connections, particularly between Australia and China. So again, we see a balancing there between the private self, if you like, and the business career, which has always, in Kevin's case, been offset by a very substantial commitment to what we might call the public good. Now, I first met Kevin in 2012 when the Foundation for Australian Studies in China was about to advertise the inaugural BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University. FASIC was, a number of people were involved in the creation of FASIC, but I think it's fair to say that the driving force and the brains behind the organisation, that was Kevin, because it was a complex undertaking. It's also, I think, worth noting that it's the first privately supported, not-for-profit organisation to support the study of Australia overseas. And many other countries would love a FASIC, but the Australia-China relationship has drawn tremendous benefit from that. And again, as chair in that period, 2013 to 2016, it was very clear to me what an enormous undertaking that FASIC role was for Kevin, both in terms of travel, but in terms of constant liaison, keeping on top of the business of the foundation and so on. So Kevin has a tremendous story of commitment. He's done a great deal for the Australia-China relationship. And I very much look forward to hearing what Kevin has to say and to hear his China story as opposed to ours. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Walker. As always, I enjoy your speech and a great sense of humor. And you can see that while you are a great historian and a great writer, and I highly recommend David's history book. It's really interesting to read and very engaging. Thank you again, Professor Walker. Like many people these days, I listen to a lot of podcasts thanks to COVID. ABC Radio is currently running a podcast series called You Don't Know Me, presented by Virginia Trioli, who uncovers very interesting, often surprising stories of those well-known public figures who we have seen or heard or watched or grown up with on the stage or screen or the radio, and who we have thought and assumed that we have known about. I found those uncovered news stories fascinating, and that's exactly how I feel about today's speaker of my China story, Kevin Hobgood-Brown. Many people I know have known Kevin for many years, primarily through his role at the FASIC, Foundation for Australian Studies in China. But today we're going to hear and uncover fascinating stories about Kevin that we don't know of. We will firstly listen to Kevin's presentation, followed by my conversation with Kevin. After that, if we have time, we will take a couple of questions from the audience. Now, please welcome Kevin Hobgood-Brown AM to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Jing, and David, thank you for those kind words in your introduction. With a historian like you on the line today, I better stick with the facts. So I may have to throw out a few pages of my prepared remarks, but I'm honored to be here with you today. Jing, I loved the previous sessions with Linda, Tracy, and Richard. It's a great series, and I just hope that I can uphold the standard that they have all set for this great series. I'd like to tell everyone that today I'm speaking from the land of the Wallumedegal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and their elders, past, present, and future. At the beginning, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not a China scholar or a China expert. I've had the good fortune in my life, particularly in more recent years, to be surrounded by bona fide China scholars, people like David Goodman and Jocelyn Che and Colin McCarris, John Fitzgerald, Louise Edwards. I could go on. There are just so many Australian luminaries who have really helped our understanding of China. And I've been fortunate to count many of these China scholars as my good friends as well as colleagues. But I've never personally undertaken the rigorous language and scholarly training that it takes to make a true China scholar and expert. And that's what makes these people so impressive. So today I'm really will be talking about some of my experiences and observations gathered in my time in China over a period of 39 years. To that extent, they're personal. They may not necessarily reflect what was going on in other parts of China or even in the same city where I was located. So please accept my comments accordingly. A few years ago, I was visiting Peking University. I think it was a couple of years after David took up his post as the BHP chair. And I was given a tour of the brand new law library at Peking University. An amazing facility, a state-of-the-art building, better than any law library I'd seen. A young student interviewed me for one of the student publications, and she wanted to talk to me about my years in the early 80s, 83 to 87, teaching in the law department. So in my responses to some of her questions, I commented about how impressed I'd been by my students who excelled while working in pretty hardship conditions. The young reporter was puzzled by my response, and she said, "What do you mean hardships?" And I explained that our classes met in a building that was at least 80 years old at the time. It had no heating. There was no glass in the windows. Newspaper had been glued over the window panes to stop the wind from blowing through. During the winter months, when the temperatures were well below zero for many months at a time, my students attended class wearing at least 4 layers of clothes, winter hats, mittens, gloves. I never understood how they could take notes wearing mittens and gloves, but they did it. The reporter looked at me quite stunned and said, "Are you joking? I assured her that I was not joking, but I realized at that moment that this smart, talented young woman had probably never known a China that wasn't technologically advanced, materially prosperous, and culturally confident, like it was in 2015 when we had this discussion. That conversation troubled me. Her interview style was impeccable, and she was clearly a very talented reporter. But it occurred to me that newer generations in China might not be that familiar with where China was 50 years ago or even 40 years ago, and that this would be a real shame. I feel that we need to understand where China was in order to understand where it really is today. And for that reason, even though I've got a few tales to tell over a 39-year period, I'd really like to just focus on the 80s and maybe a little bit on the 90s. I'd love to talk about China's amazing high-speed rail network, the 21st century airports, the amazing modern cities. But instead, I'd like to talk about the China that I first met 39 years ago. It was a very different place. Frankly, China was economically poor at the time. I think when I moved to the country, it had foreign reserves in the millions, not billions, not trillions like it has today. The reforms were new. No one knew where the reforms would go. No one knew whether the reforms would be continued or whether they would be successful. Frankly, I think that China's accomplishments over the last 40-year period are even more impressive when you consider where China was when the reforms began. And so we're going to focus on a little bit of that today. I arrived in China, in Shanghai, on a coastal Chinese registered freighter in July of 1983 that regularly traveled between Hong Kong and Shanghai. The freighter carried around 50 passengers, but it was primarily a cargo ship. No containers, just cargo the old-fashioned way. They dumped stuff right down into a big cargo hole with cranes and pulleys. And carried all kinds of goods between Hong Kong and Shanghai. The freighter made its way through the massive estuary of the Huangpu River and docked essentially at the Bund, just north of where Suzhou Creek runs into the Huangpu River. We pulled right up to the bank. The gangplanks were lowered, and the long process of disembarking passengers and freight began. There were a handful of foreigners on board. We went through Chinese immigration and customs on the spot. The waterfront in Shanghai at that time looked closer to the Shanghai Bund of 1920s than what it looks today. You would never arrive in Shanghai that way today. On generally the same spot where I docked, today there's a gleaming passenger cruise terminal where fancy cruise ships dock and unload their thousands of generally Western cruising tourists. A humble cargo freighter wouldn't get any place close to the Bund these days. It would most likely be unloaded at a purpose-built cargo depot many kilometers away from downtown Shanghai. As an individual foreign traveler at that time, I was required to check in at the local office of the China International Travel Service in order to book hotels, trains, basically take care of any needs that I had. I arranged to stay at the Peace Hotel along the Bund. This was long before it was renovated to become the Fairmont Peace Hotel today. And I paid about 7% of today's room rate in order to spend a couple of nights in that famous hotel. Shanghai was my first experience to use foreign exchange certificates. It was my first experience with white rabbit candy, which I still love today from Shanghai. And unless you lived or worked or traveled in China between 1980 and 1994, you probably have never heard of foreign exchange certificates. They were phased out in the mid 90s. FECs were essentially Chinese currency nominated in renminbi yuan, but were used only by holders of foreign exchange. So if I went in and changed $100 at the Bank of China, I would receive foreign exchange certificates. I would not receive domestic renminbi yuan. I would receive foreign exchange certificates, which at the end of my stay in China could be reconverted into a foreign currency. This was a strange system. I'd never seen it anywhere in the world. And as far as I know, it was unique to China at the time. Fortunately, when I eventually started at Peking University as a foreign expert, I was issued a special little card that allowed me to use domestic renminbi yuan. And so I essentially had the best of both worlds in those years, since I was paid in domestic renminbi yuan. But the whole concept of foreign exchange certificates, that was a 15-year reality in our life in China, which today is totally gone. From Shanghai, I took the train to Nanjing. It took 5 hours. Today, it takes less than an hour on the fast train. When I arrived in Nanjing, it was 10:30 at night. There wasn't a street light or an illuminated building in sight. The whole city was dark. And most unnerving to me is the old Shanghai taxi that I got in to take me to my guest house, drove through the streets with no headlights. And instead, the driver would toot on the horn about every 10 seconds to let the bicyclists know they better get out of the way. And this was a common practice in the day. Driving without your headlights continued in big cities for another 2 or 3 years until they developed new ways to keep the bicyclists and the cars apart. And I learned later that not using your headlights was a consideration in favor of the bicyclist, because if you were on a bicycle and you had these headlights coming to you, you were essentially blinded. And so the idea was, since most people were on bikes, the cars had to give way, so they drove without lights. The trip from Nanjing to Beijing was another 36 hours. Today, it'd take you 4 hours by fast train. And I have to say that when I arrived in Beijing, I loved it from the beginning. The wide boulevards, the crisp, clear blue skies, haven't heard that term really used with Beijing in more recent decades. The impressive mountains to the north of Beijing, vibrant street light. There were many old buildings. But it was a highly regulated life, both for us as foreigners and for our colleagues who were Chinese citizens. As a foreigner, I had to live in designated locations. Basically, most foreigners either lived in hotels or in a series of designated apartments that were primarily for diplomats and for journalists. So most of the people I dealt with, because I regularly dealt with other foreign residents on a business basis, were all hotel dwellers. The only exceptions were foreign teachers and foreign students who lived on campus. And at least for the foreign teachers, they generally had separate accommodations on the campuses. Generally, Chinese citizens were not allowed to visit the places where we lived. And so I found, to my chagrin, one day early in my stay in Beijing, that I had invited a few students to come to the Friendship Hotel where I was living, only about 2 kilometers away from Peking University, so that we could prepare for a class together. And they couldn't get in. They didn't know, and I didn't know that there were restrictions on that. And so when they got to the front gate of the Friendship Hotel, the guards kind of laughed at him, said, "You're crazy. You're not getting in here. Do you have a letter from your danwei telling us, why you're coming in this place?" And the students were pretty shocked and dragged themselves back to the campus. No one had phones in those days, so I spent hours waiting for the students, wondering what had happened. It was only later that we really twigged on the fact that there were pretty strict rules on this kind of stuff, and we weren't allowed to sort of commingle in these ways. I made some really fantastic friends, and some of those friendships have endured for 40 years. But those were friendships that, at least in the early years, were formed during working hours, because we weren't allowed really to fraternize with each other outside of work. I can recall in 1985, one of my lawyer friends came to me and said, really excited. He said, "Wow, I've just been given assigned a new apartment just inside the second ring road." And he told me with great excitement about all the attributes of this fantastic apartment. And after he talked about it for a while, he said, "Well, Kevin, I'd love to have you come over and see it. But if I do that, I have to go to my neighborhood committee. I have to prepare an application to have you into my home. I need to tell them what it's all about. They'll have to interrogate me. They may or may not grant the request. And then when you come, after you leave, I'll have to write a report to them about what we did and said, and they can question me again about that." He said, you wouldn't be offended if I just don't invite you over." And of course, I perfectly understood all of that. But it was just a sign of the different environment that everyone lived at that particular time. Lindsay, could you cue up the exercise music?
北京人民广播电台，现在是广播体操时间，请大家准备好，我们一起做广播体操。第6套广播体操，现在开始。预备起！1、2、3、4、5、6、7、8、2、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、2、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、7、8、3、4、5、6、 八、四、二、三、四、五、六、七，四肢运动，一、二、三、四、五、六、七、八。
Thank you very much, Lindsay. So my friends, I recorded that off the radio in my hotel room in Beijing on the 15th of April in 1985. Why did I do that? And why are we showing it right now? Well, I did it because it was a big part of my life at the time. It was a big part of everyone's life. At 10 o'clock in the morning, no matter where you were in North China, this music appeared on loudspeakers along the streets, in factories, in schools, at the Friendship Hotel where I live. And everyone got out and did their exercises. You wouldn't see it necessarily today, but I figured that after hearing me talk for a few minutes, you probably need to get the blood moving. And so that was your exercise music. At Peking University, I was hired by Professor Ray Mu, who was one of China's leading legal scholars. He had hired me to teach common law courses in the economic law section of the new law department at Peking University. He himself was an amazing person. He'd been educated in the 30s at the Sorbonne in Paris. He went on to get a graduate degree in Germany. He spoke about 4 or 5 languages fluently, including English. And he was the new dean of the law school. And it was his job to set up a program that would take the law program into the future. Professor Ray Mu told me that just before I moved to Beijing, the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Warren Burger, had visited Beijing, and there was a private banquet with Ren Jianxing, who became the president of China's Supreme Court. Professor Ray was there. There were a few other legal scholars, and they had a banquet to talk about China's legal challenges and compare notes on the respective systems in the United States and China. And Justice Burger turned to President Ren and said, what's your biggest challenge? And Professor Ren said, well, in China, we need approximately 100,000 lawyers in order to move the reform program further and develop a modern economy. But we only have about 6,000, and most of those were trained before 1949. So that's our problem. And Justice Burger looked at him and said, well, in the United States, we've got 650,000 lawyers. You tell me how many you want, and I'll send them to you immediately. That didn't happen, but I suspect that I was one of those 650,000 lawyers who did end up in Beijing for the purpose of playing a small role in the training of a new group of domestic Chinese lawyers who would help with that reform and development process. One of the things that Ray Mu asked me immediately, he said, could you teach generally American legal topics using the Socratic method? I thought this was a fantastic idea, mainly because I was taught by the Socratic method, and it would be easier for me to teach these law subjects in a way that was familiar to me. For those of you who are not familiar, the Socratic method is where the professor asks questions. The students respond, and that starts a dialogue. But the teacher does not lecture. The teacher doesn't say, oh, this is the principle and this is the holding. Those details are elicited through a pretty rigorous question and answer process. The process is designed to force students to think and to analyze and be quick in their analysis and to sort of create new lines of thought. This was terrifying to my students. It was totally different from anything that they had had in the past. We were using American casebook methods in English. And the first few weeks or months were very, very difficult for my students. I give them full credit that they stuck with it. And you know something? After they figured out that they weren't going to be pilloried or criticized, because that was not part of the process. The process is just to continue with the questions until you get to a principle or you get to an establishment of facts or holdings. They were fantastic. They were better at it than I was. They just really were some of the most incredibly talented, hardworking people that I've ever worked with. One of those particularly bright students came to me one day after about 4 months and pulled me aside, very, very nervous. And he said, Professor Kevin, he said, the UN has just released a report stating that the average adult needs 2,600 calories per day to sustain themselves. The UN found that the average Beijing resident gets about 1,800 calories per day. And so therefore, my fellow students and I have thought that you should reduce our workload by 30%, since we're only receiving 70% of the calories that the UN recommends that we receive. I was blown away by this incredible argument. I thought it was brilliant. I gave him full credit for being able to deliver it to me. Unfortunately, I said, you guys are doing such a fantastic job. I don't feel like I can really reduce your workload because you're doing so well already on the 70% of calories. So I'd be doing you a disservice if I reduced your workload. But that was just a really interesting, it was one of the most unique appeals I've ever seen or heard for reducing a student's workload. Many of those students went on to study overseas. Most of them studied overseas. Even that process was a process today that we can't really relate to. There was no internet. Everything was done by mail. There were no fax machines. This was before any digital age. And so if a student wanted to apply for admission to Harvard or to the University of London or to Sydney University, they had to get a physical application form. They had to fill it out. They had to prepare all of the supporting documents like transcripts. Everyone needed 2 reference letters. They had to be in English. And every application required at least $50, 50 US dollars. And where were you going to get $50 in Beijing or anywhere in China at that time? So I developed, I was just part of that routine. And so I wrote dozens of reference letters for people, typed them out on my old portable manual typewriter. And I guess it worked because most of those people ended up studying abroad. And I had plenty of $50 bills that people would exchange. I'd take renminbi since I could use renminbi, and they would take that $50 bill, they'd clip it to their application form, drop it in the mail, and lo and behold, the $50 was received on the other end. And we can't imagine people doing the same thing today, but dozens and dozens of students did that, went through that very, very rigorous process, went overseas, came back, and really contributed to China's development. Jane, I know I'm running over, so I'll just tell you one last little story about the development of consumer society, because everybody wanted to buy stuff as they slowly accumulated funds. But it was hard to find stuff to buy. Flying pigeon bicycles were the most popular bicycle in the country. Everybody wanted one, and they commanded a premium. Well, I remember once in 1984, reading in one of the local newspapers in Beijing, some guy had bought a flying pigeon bicycle. He'd saved for 2 years, bought the bicycle, got it home, and it was a piece of junk. As he did more investigation, it turned out it wasn't really a flying pigeon bicycle. It was made by some other factory that just produced pretty shoddy bicycles, but they had badged it a flying pigeon. And so this guy was saying, well, why can't the government protect us from this? You know, if I buy something that is supposed to be flying pigeon, why can't it be? And when I read that article, I thought to myself, this is why China will be successful in its reform process. It's not because America or anybody else is saying, oh, you need intellectual property protections, you need a whole system. It was because China recognized that it had a need to develop these types of systems in order to protect their citizens and in order to protect the rights of companies who invest themselves in certain technology and intellectual property. And in fact, that's the way it happened. Well, after 3.5 years, it was time to go back to America. I wanted to depart China in an unusual way. So I was able to receive a special travel permit for my wife, Lucy, and me to depart China from Tibet. And so we traveled to Lhasa. This was in the middle of winter. It was in January. There weren't any foreigners in Lhasa. We had Lhasa pretty much to ourselves for 3 or 4 days. We went to the Potala Palace. There was no one there. We went in and had the run of the place for 3 or 4 hours, going in every room, looking at every item. There were no barriers. It was just an incredibly amazing experience. And then we had a Toyota Land Cruiser with a driver and 4 bags, canvas bags of oxygen, which the company insisted go with us. And we drove overland from Lhasa down to the border with Nepal, taking about 5 or 6 days. We had to do the last 8 kilometers on foot because of an avalanche that had wiped out the road. But once we got to that border crossing across a river between Nepal and China, the Chinese border guards looked at our papers. I was a little bit apprehensive. They took my residence permit, which they were supposed to do, stamped our passports, and that was it. That was the end of our first 3.5 years. So, Jing, I'm sorry I went on a little bit longer, but over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Kevin. Well, fascinating stories. I just feel like such authentic China you have presented. There are some parts I, grew up there and I'm very familiar with, but there are other parts I had no idea or didn't even know. And for example, you're talking about the teaching law students, bringing law education is actually very closely related to a reform in China. And it was really interesting. And also you're such a pioneer in many ways, things that you were allowed to do or you were doing, you did back then in China. We didn't even know of, or, like the way you left China. It's amazing. It's fascinating. But I also have lots of questions for you. And I think those questions are actually quite correspond to your experiences, but will be on different sides. So it'd be fascinating. Thank you so much, Kevin, for your wonderful presentation. We can clearly see that there are things that we didn't know before about you. And it's such full of a rich experience in life. And let's start from the beginning. I want audience to count how many cities and countries I'm going to see this in this paragraph. Kevin, you were born in California, then attended the International School of Brussels before moving to the capital of Congo, Kinshasa. You then returned to America to go to university. Right after you finished university, you got a job in Iran, and you taught at the Tehran American School. After that, you went back to US to study law, followed by a job at Texas. We're only halfway through. In 1982, you quit your law firm job and followed your wife, Lucy, to Hong Kong. From there, you moved to Beijing to teach at law school of Peking University as a 外国专家, as you mentioned, foreign expert, whilst also working at an international law firm. You also had postings in San Francisco, Taipei, and Sydney. In 1996, you moved to Sydney from Beijing. Audience, have I lost you? How many cities and countries Kevin have moved in and out? You have since been based in Sydney. So my question is, did you always want to go to China, or you just couldn't stop moving from one place to another and got to China by chance? Also, you had gone to very different countries like Congo, Belgium, and Iran before you went to China. Would you say those foreign or abroad experiences had prepared you for China, or did China still surprise you? How much did you know about China before you went there?
Well, thanks, Jean. Really amazing questions. I'll answer the last one first. I didn't know much about China because in Texas in 1982, you could not find out much about China. The US had diplomatic relations with China for about 3 years at that point, but there was no China industry, so to speak. many of the China scholars had grown up at a time when the Republic of China on Taiwan was their focus and where they had done their primary study. So I searched libraries throughout North Texas for books, for articles, anything that would give me a clue as to what was going on in China. Nothing. You could not even take Chinese lessons. There was no place in North China where you could study Chinese. So it was pretty dismal. Fox Butterfield, the famous American journalist, had just published a book called China, Alive in the Bitter Sea in 1982. I read that book from cover to cover. It presented a more contemporary view of China, but it was an incredibly depressing book about China because it basically followed people's hardship. So the long and the short of it is, I went to China with probably just a fraction of the preparation that people would have today, and learned on the spot. Did those other countries that we lived in help? It did, not because there was any relationship between those cultures or languages in China, but because you learn after you live overseas, as you, Jing, have already demonstrated in Australia. You have to adapt, you have to be sensitive to people's local needs, to the local customs and so forth. And we pretty much had those attitudes already when we moved to China.
That's definitely, for people who live and worked overseas in many countries, they all, like you, have a very open mind, so ready to experience and ready to accept what is there. So I suppose that's the preparation. My second question, you were among the very small group of international lawyers teaching and working in China in the early 1980s. Because I know when we were there at universities in those years, we had quite a lot of foreign teachers, 外教, teaching English language and literature primarily, but not many teaching law. And law as the principal and law schools were back then either new or reinstated at only a few select universities. What was like teaching law at Peking University? How did the students respond to the subjects you were teaching? Because the concept of law and legal systems were very different in China, especially back then.
Thanks, Jing. I think I can make a couple of points there. First is China had already decided that whatever legal system it had developed in the 50s and 60s was not appropriate for moving forward. It wasn't part of the reform agenda to build on those old systems. So they were starting from scratch in the early 80s. And that's why the law schools were given such priority at that time. And it was expected that most law students would have to be proficient in some foreign language. Obviously, the ones I taught were proficient in English, but there were others who were focusing on French and other foreign languages, because it was expected that they would be at the forefront of dealing with companies and with governments from these other parts of the world. My students were incredibly respectful of me. I was only 3 or 4 years older than most of my students, and I wasn't prepared for how respectful students were of their teachers. I came from the US system where there is not that ingrained respect for teachers. We've all had teachers that we loved and had great affection for. But the general respect for teachers, it just isn't the same in the United States. And so when I had students serving me tea before every class and sort of en masse jumping if I asked a question or needed something, I was quite taken aback by it. And I felt quite unworthy of that. But it was, I think it was a reflection of how seriously they took all of this. And even though they worked very hard, they never complained. Other than that one a very creative appeal to reduce their workload, I never heard a student complain about the process we were going through. The other thing I would just say is that China was absolutely methodical and disciplined in the way it was building its new system. Students that I taught were dispatched to go to different parts of the world to learn about patents, to learn about trademarks, to learn about dispute resolution. And they would come back to China and compile all of their experiences. And you know, the forerunner of the National Development and Reform Commission would look at all of this experience and say, well, what works? Well, in Czechoslovakia, they do this. In Austria, they do that. In Australia, they do this. What works the best? And so I would have to say that it was an enormously impressive process of building a new system. We couldn't do it in Australia. We don't have the resources or the discipline or the foresight, I think, to do that. But China did a really incredible job.
Mm. Fascinating to hear all that, you know, like I didn't know, and I'm sure many people, even if they grow up in China, didn't know that part either. So it's really interesting. And each question covers only one aspect, and then you have so many stories. This one is about the front cover, the picture that we had. You know, you have this driver's license, because right till I left China in early 1988, drivers to us is strictly an occupation. It's occupation. What you are, you're a driver. And I didn't know anyone who drove himself or had his own car. So I was very surprised to see that you had a driver's license in Beijing in 1984. We all, including Professor Jocelyn Che, had a bicycle riding license, not a driver's license. How did you find driving your own car around Beijing, assuming at least no much traffic jam? How did Chinese people respond to your self-driving?
Well, thank you, Jing. Having my own car and driving was a lifesaver for me, because every morning I was going from Yoyibingguan up to Beida. I would teach for 3 or 4 hours, and then I would drive down to Zhenguo Menwai, to the Zhenguo Hotel where my law office was, and then in the evening I would go back to Yoyibingguan. And if I'd had to bicycle or take public transport, half of my day would have been spent commuting. But with a private car, I could get from Haidian district to Zhenguo Menwai in 25 minutes, basically. Driving was a challenge because there were still predominantly bicycles on the road, and bicycles were not accustomed to yielding for cars. And so I just had, you know, heart attack after heart attack after people would just pull out of side alleys in front of me. But I finally got the hang of it, and I can happily say that I drove for 3.5 years that first time, and then for another couple of years in the 90s. I never injured anyone or killed anyone, although there were plenty of times I probably wished I had. I started off with a bicycle. I brought with me a French Peugeot, and I thought to myself, okay, if everyone gets around on a bike, I'll get around on a bike too. And it was essentially a racing bike. What I found pretty quickly was the proper bike for Beijing at that time was a Chinese bike. You know, you sit up high, the handlebars aren't down, you're not lean, and you go slow because you go with the flow. With this French racing bike, you know, I should have been out there going, you know, 20, 30 kilometers an hour. You couldn't do that because everyone else was going 3 kilometers an hour. And so the Peugeot bike I gave away to a Chinese friend later, and that's when I bought the car.
So true. When I first saw the racing car, I was racing bicycle, I was very surprised. How could anyone ride on the bicycle like that? Yeah, that's not a bicycle as we know of or grow up with. But you know, like you previously you mentioned a Friendship Hotel that would not allow other people to go in. And in China, especially in China in those days, cars were allowed. So if you drive a car, you can get through. But if you just buy a person walk, you may not walk through. So that's why I'm asking you, when you drive your own car, and how did Chinese respond to that? Do they feel like is that endearing experience or alienating? Wow, you know, he can drive his own car.
I think, Jing, it was a reflection of the fact that the harsh reality was foreigners had many privileges that my Chinese friends did not have. You know, we could buy stuff at the Friendship store. We didn't suffer from rationing coupons. We had special waiting rooms at the train station. And it was just example after example where foreigners, I think, were treated better than other people. And that was reflective of a lot of different parts of the old system. Part of it was being hospitable and showing people respect, in this case, showing the foreigners respect. So when I showed up with a car, I think a lot of my local friends just thought, oh, this is what foreigners do. You know, this guy's been able to get a car, you know, good on him. Maybe one day we'll get one too. So it wasn't something that we talked about. People didn't really consider it strange, and I didn't have any comments from people about it.
Yeah, very interesting. I worked at the New South Wales Attorney General's Department for 10 years after I got my PhD. So I worked as a compensation manager, dealing with applications from victims of violent crimes. I was fascinated by the law and the administration of law, also because they were very different from what I knew of in China. You first worked as a San Francisco law-based firm in Beijing, and also later on you as the general counsel for the Sino-Gold. The approach and acceptance of rules and laws are different in China. To many people, rules and laws are bendable, not always for corrupt motivations, and that's what people assume, but often, or rather, a push for humane consideration, what Chinese say 人情, over and above the rules, 人情味, for humane considerations. Can you share with us your experience, particularly challenges in practicing law in China in the early years?
In the early years, the amount of law that pertained to foreign investment in economic activities probably totaled 100 pages. There just wasn't a whole lot of black letter law in those days. What there was pretty rigorously enforced. So when I started working in Beijing, the only form of economic activity for a foreign company who wanted to establish an operation in China was to set up an equity joint venture with a Chinese partner. The equity joint venture law and the implementing regulations were pretty general, but by practice, there was an expectation that the joint venture contract and the articles of association of the joint venture would look a certain way. So I would have to say that the first half a dozen joint ventures that I worked on in that equity joint venture structure all looked the same. It didn't matter whether they were manufacturing computers or building hotels and operating hotels, the contracts all looked the same. And that's because when you sent the documents through to the local administration for industry and commerce, or its predecessor at that time, they wanted to see something that looked like the model contract and the model articles of association. You wouldn't find that kind of rigidity today. But in the early part of the process, that kind of lack of variation was probably a natural part of the process of adapting something new. 10 years later, there were a variety of different joint ventures that could be established. There was great flexibility. You could establish a wholly foreign-owned enterprise. And of course, the form of contracts greatly expanded, as well as the types of economic activities that people would undertake. There was always something unexpected, culturally, sometimes regulatory, but very often culturally. If I can fast forward for 1 minute, Jing, in the mid 90s, my law firm represented a big American company where one of their key employees was a single woman from Inner Mongolia who was killed tragically in a car wreck. She was not married. Her family was all from a little place in Inner Mongolia. The company had an insurance policy on her, which delivered $5 million US to the family. We were worried about that money not going to the family because of a whole variety of concerns at that time. And so we set up a complicated trust system where the money would go into a trust that would be owned by the family. And then the money would be distributed to the family on a regular basis, according to rules. I had insisted that all the documents be translated into Chinese. The whole family came down from Inner Mongolia, camped in my office for about 2 weeks, while my best Chinese lawyer read the documents to the family, page by page, day by day. And after about 10 days, the lawyer came into my office quite agitated. She said, "Kevin, we got a problem." I said, well, what's the problem? She said, "I don't know, but the family all of a sudden is really upset." And the family were just good salt of the earth people. The matriarch of the family was like the commune leader. She was tough as nails. I had to get a spittoon for her in the office because she chewed tobacco the whole time. When I walked into the boardroom, the whole family was stony-faced looking at me with a bit of suspicion. And as we tried to figure out what the problem was, there were language issues where my Chinese colleague wasn't getting what they were saying. We finally pulled out a map and they said, last night at the hostel, we took what you had been telling us and we could see that this is a Cayman Islands trust. And we looked at the Cayman Islands and we've seen that the Cayman Islands is located in the Bermuda Triangle. And we know that things disappear without explanation in the Bermuda Triangle. And so what you're doing is you're setting up our trust in a place where our $5 million could disappear and we would have no recourse. Well, I can tell you, when I was going to law school, I was not prepared for that kind of question from a client. And no one on my team had really thought that this would be an issue. Fortunately, I just said, oh, I'm glad you raised that question. Let me just explain it to you. The trustee is located in the Cayman Islands. The money, the $5 million, is located in Citibank in New York. So even if the trustee disappears in the Cayman Islands, your money's still okay because it's in New York. And in the trust document, we've got all kinds of procedures so that you can replace the trustee. And they said, oh, thank God, we don't care if we get a new trustee, just as long as the $5 million is okay. And so I use that as an example because no matter what series of negotiations you were in, there were always very unique, unpredictable elements like that.
This is very much relating to my next question, because not only you worked as a lawyer and you also have worked in a highly accomplished executive roles, government or non-government, including Australian Council, Australian China Business Council, FASIC, Sino-Gold, and currently HHK Advisory. So primarily dealing or working with China. And you have been working really well with them from all the stories that we also have heard quite smoothly. So what were your kind of secret recipes in working? And also clearly you have the trust. How did you get their trust from Chinese counterparts, administrators, business people, academics, and bureaucrats?
Well, thanks, Jing. I'm not sure that everybody trusted me, for one thing, but I've always felt that regardless of what kind of project you're working on, you have to develop a rapport with your counterparts on the other side, and I think that acknowledges a very key part of Chinese culture is that people like to feel confidence in the people that they're doing work with. And so rather than do the Western thing of just immediately plowing straight into the issues, I felt very comfortable taking time for all of us to get to know each other and, spend some time with each other. And like David Walker and others, I've had a few bottles of Baijiu in the process. I think that developing that kind of personal connection is critical. You don't have to be best friends, but you have to have some sort of personal connection. You have to earn the respect of the other side. And if you've got the respect of the other side, that will carry you a very long way. And then lastly, I think that you have to learn what the other side's drivers are. Even today, after 39 years of working in China, when I work on a new project, I'm often surprised as what the drivers are on the other side. They're things I wouldn't have anticipated. Sometimes they're organizational issues. Someone needs to deliver something, to their superiors. Sometimes there's a very acute commercial driver, but you have to find what that driver is in order to develop a successful transaction. Mm-hmm. All of that takes time. Westerners generally don't like taking time, but it's critical.
Yeah, great answer, great answer. The other question I really want to ask you, because David touched on as well, because there are over 40 Australian Studies Centres located in China, across China. What role do you think those Australian Studies Centres play, and why is it so important for FASIC to support those centres?
Thanks, Jing. Well, those 40 Australian Studies Centres belong to their respective universities. They don't belong to us here in Australia. They are like a Chinese department, language department at Sydney University, or their academic departments within their home universities. So it's always occurred to me as an Australian that if someone wants to learn about us, we should do everything we can to help them. I mean, most people in the world don't care. But if someone does care and they want to learn more about us, this is a heaven-sent opportunity. And as you know, those Australian Studies Centres were, the impetus for those were the 9 original scholars who came from China to Sydney University in 1979. And that has developed into this very impressive network of Australian Studies Centres. The people in those centres are people that all 3 of us would consider to be impressive colleagues and good friends. And why is it important for someone in China to understand a little bit about Australia, about our history, about our literature, our culture, our systems? Well, for the same reason it's important for us to know about China, is that all of my friends who have exposure to China, when they hear an Australian politician spout some nonsense about China, they have a personal experience base which allows them to say, that's not right. My experience is different. There's a different reality out there that is important for us. And to a person, the people I have met at the Australian Studies Centres around China have that connection with Australia that allows them to say, hold on a second, we know things to be a certain way. we know Australia to be of a certain character. And that's the fundamental building block of a bilateral relationship. And so I think that there is no other country in the world that has 40 study centers focused on that country in China. And so this is a very unique phenomena that is unique to Australia and unique to Australia. There are more Australian study centers in China than there are in Australia. And to me, this is a national priority that we should be encouraging and supporting where we can.
So true, so true. Understanding has to be based on knowledge, and so it's vital. And your China experience is primarily focused on two big sectors. One is mineral resources, and the other is education, which we just touched on. Are your experiences working in these two sectors vastly different? Is there any link between the two as far as the Australian-China relations is concerned?
Well, I think on the surface, there's not much comparison. You know, I worked for a mining company that had 5 gold mines in China. But I think that there were certain characteristics of those operations. Sinogold demonstrated to the Chinese mining industry that you could develop successful mines without killing your people, without injuring your people, and by paying back and contributing to the local community. And many of the practices that Sinogold introduced at its mines are commonplace across China today. I think that with education, you see a very similar commitment to local engagement. It's about knowing what the local community wants, what they need, and what they would like to do with you. And so I see that the fundamentals of a mining company engaging with its local community as being very similar to the way a university will engage with its local community, whether that community is in Beijing or in Chongqing or Suzhou or some other place. And particularly in the area of education, it's very much a two-way street. We learn things from China that are very relevant to us here in Australia. And occasionally we have experience that's also relevant to China.
Very insightful. I have a few last quick questions I must ask. It's so interesting to hear what you have said, and we must hear what you are going to say to this last few questions. This quick one is, when you opened Tracy Holmes' My China Story, you used the parable of the blind man and an elephant as an analogy to people's view of China. China being huge, so huge with many aspects and layers of complexities. So what is China like to you?
It's wonderful in every way. As you can tell, I have a real passion for the friendships that I've developed there. I love Chinese culture. I'm so impressed with what China has done over the last 40 years. I love Chinese cuisine. I love Chinese humor. One of the first jokes that I ever heard in Chinese was given to me by a colleague at Peking University in probably late 84, early 85. It was the first time I ever got a joke that was conveyed to me in Chinese. It was basically this. She said, all in Chinese. Oh, Kevin, a famous American professor has just arrived, and you might be interested in his story. I said, okay, tell me. And she said, well, he had a meeting with us yesterday, Tuesday, and we asked him, Professor so-and-so, you just arrived in China on Monday, you're meeting with us on Tuesday, and you're leaving on Wednesday. What is the purpose of your visit? And the American professor says, well, I'm writing a book about China. And my Chinese colleague says, oh, that's very interesting. And what is the name of your new book? And he says, China, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And I love that story. I loved it in part because I understood it. So it was a great language breakthrough for me. But I thought it was so typical, taking the mickey out of the foreigners who drop into China for a brief visit and say, well, we got this place nailed. You know, I'm an expert now. And, you know, my Chinese colleagues have always been amused by that phenomenon.
I would like to hear if you can give us, you have so many experiences, and is there any particular one which is heartbreaking and one heartwarming? I think heartwarming, you told us a couple. Can you tell us a heartbreaking experience?
Well, I'm going to have to say, Jing, I do know lots of heartbreaking stories in China. They've been conveyed to me by friends. So I probably wouldn't talk about them, but I would recommend that people read David Walker and Li Yao's book. This is an amazing book, Happy Together. Li Yao very honestly and very clearly describes so many experiences from his early life and up through the Cultural Revolution that many people can relate to. And there's kind of a universal sense of heartbreak that we would all feel when we read some of those experiences. So I would say on the heartbreak side, read David and Li Yao's book, because I think that those are very moving experiences there. In heartwarming, go to any university in China on graduation day, and you will never see happier, more exuberant, proud family gatherings. And so every time I'm in China around graduation day, I always try to be on some campus, because you'll never see a better gathering of people. Very heartwarming.
So true, so true. Next, one second last question. If you had the power to change one thing in China, what would that be and why?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I wouldn't change a thing.
Why not?
And the reason, not because China's perfect, it's obviously got lots of challenges, just like any country does. But the noted China scholar Jonathan Spence wrote a fascinating book called To Change China that came out about 20 years ago. And basically he recounts over a 300-year period all of the Western attempts to change China. They were missionaries, they were politicians, they were business people. Probably most of them were well-intended, but there was this notion that the West had to change China. Of course, they were all total failures. China is influenced by a whole range of factors, just like any country is. But I think that any of us who go into China thinking that we're going to change China, it's just nonsense. And so we can perhaps influence a small number of people through our activities, but let's be realistic. And so I really like Jonathan Spence's work. I'd recommend it to everyone, but I just don't think about the concept of changing China.
Very thoughtful and a smart answer. Identity is it's such a hot topic these days. So my question is, who do you think you are?
I ask myself that question a lot. I'm very definitely Australian. You know, I was getting Australian citizenship was one of the happiest days of my life. But I'm also every other place I've lived. I mean, I've clearly got, in addition to a strong American accent, lots of American perceptions and habits. But I'm also, you know, along with my wife, very deeply involved in Congo. very committed to China and China's relationship with Australia and the rest of the world. So a little bit of all of the above, I think.
You've been to so many cities and countries, and you have to choose one city as your favorite one. Favorite has to be one. Which city is that?
Well, with apologies to David and all my other friends in Melbourne, I'd have to say it's got to be Sydney.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for your wonderful, wonderful stories and the insights that you have shared with us. Such an authentic and humanized China that are coming from your stories. It's really wonderful. And please thank Kevin for such a wonderful, generosity and kindness of sharing all these stories. It's wonderful. And I think it's really, I think I have one question, maybe. Is there one question? Yes, so thank you, Kevin, for sharing your stories, insights into China in the 1980s. So that's a Daozhi. How would you compare the Chinese students in the 80s and those you have encountered in more recent years? A very good question.
For one thing, hi, Dr. I look forward to seeing you soon. A good question. I would say that many of the Chinese students I work with today are far more worldly. So in 1983, students in China had very little access to events outside of China. The Beida Library in those years, it had a great collection of books. Most of them weren't accessible to most students. And they were old books. And so getting contemporary information on the world, it's just a totally different world today. So when I talk to young scholars from China today, I find that they are far better informed on a lot of issues, far better informed than I am. And so I would say that they're just as brilliant, they're just as hardworking, they're just as committed and motivated as the students I worked with in the 80s, but their worldview is much broader.
I can't agree with you more, because I came as a student in those days, and compared with the students in these days that I teach, yes, they are much smarter, and much more experienced. They know a lot more than we were in those days, and also very, very intelligent, very thoughtful, and very deep into thinking of humanities, the future of the world. It's quite impressive. And thanks again, Kevin, and thanks to David. It's a wonderful session, and we will have to have a David back in one of those sessions next year. So it's wonderful. We will be wonderful to hear all those stories. And there is one last session for this year, which will be special edition in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between Australia and China, featuring who else but the first Australian ambassador to China, Professor Stephen Fitzgerald, AO, on 6th of December, in partnership with who else but the Whitlam Institute. So we will send out the invitation, and we hope we'll see you there. Again, thank you so much again, and thank you, audience, and have a good evening. See you next time.
Thank you, Jane.